The Trump administration implemented additional tariff measures in early 2025 using executive authorities that have become subject to legal challenges and policy debate. These measures add to existing tariff structures implemented since 2018. The implementation raises questions about the scope of executive power in trade policy, the distribution of economic costs between corporations and consumers, and the effectiveness of tariffs in achieving stated policy objectives, including trade deficit reduction. This analysis examines the legal framework, economic mechanisms, and structural implications of current tariff policy. This analysis examines 10 interconnected elements. First, the legal authorities used to implement tariffs without specific congressional approval for each action. Second, the nature of legal challenges filed against tariff measures. Third, the economic mechanism by which tariff costs transfer to consumers. Fourth, the asymmetry between corporate refund rights and consumer cost absorption. Fifth, trade deficit data and outcomes relative to policy objectives. Sixth, the relationship between tariff policy and inflation with distributional effects. Seventh, corporate supply chain responses. Eighth, the political framing of tariff policy. Ninth, the balance between tariff revenue and economic costs. 10th, long-term structural implications for trade architecture and economic efficiency. Presidential tariff authority derives from congressional delegation rather than inherent constitutional power. The primary authorities are Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 and Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. Section 301 authorizes action against unfair trade practices. Section 232 authorizes tariffs when imports threaten national security. Additional 2025 tariffs were implemented under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which grants broad authority during declared national emergencies. The administration declared emergency related to trade imbalances and invoked IEEPA as legal basis. The use of IEEPA for trade policy represents expansion beyond historical applications, which primarily involves sanctions for foreign policy reasons. Application to broad trade relationships with major partners represents what legal scholars describe as novel statutory interpretation. Congress has not passed specific legislation authorizing these particular tariff measures. The authorities used are standing delegations that remain in effect until Congress modifies or repeals them. Congressional debate over potentially constraining executive tariff authority has occurred, but no legislation limiting these powers has been enacted. Multiple legal challenges have been filed in the U.S. Court of International Trade. Plaintiffs include affected companies, industry associations, and state governments. Common legal arguments include claims that actions exceed statutory authority, that emergency determination lacks required factual basis, that administrative procedures were inadequate, and that measures violate separation of powers. Regarding IEEPA, challengers argue normal trade relationships do not constitute the extraordinary threat the statute requires. Government defense argues broad presidential discretion in determining threats justifying emergency powers. As of early 2025, cases are in preliminary stages with no final judgments. If courts rule tariffs were improperly imposed, companies that paid tariffs would have legal claims for refunds through standard customs procedures. Academic research examining 2018-2020 tariff implementation provides empirical evidence on cost distribution. Studies by Federal Reserve, University of Chicago, Princeton, and Columbia economists analyzed price data for tariffed goods. Findings published in the American Economic Review and Journal of Political Economy show that import prices did not decline. Chinese exporters did not reduce dollar prices. U.S. importers paid previous prices plus tariffs, indicating incidence fell on U.S. purchasers. Research on consumer prices found retail prices increased by amounts closely matching tariff rates. Pass-through was approximately 100% for most categories. The mechanism operates through supply chain pricing as each level increases prices to maintain margins. This creates asymmetry if tariffs are invalidated. Companies have documented tariff payments and can file refund claims through customs procedures. Consumers who paid higher retail prices have no comparable compensation mechanism. Retail transactions do not itemize tariff costs. No administrative mechanism exists for distributing refunds to millions of individual purchasers. One stated objective of tariff policy has been reducing the U.S. trade deficit. The trade deficit represents the difference between imports and exports. A deficit means the United States purchases more from other countries than it sells to them. The trade deficit has been a persistent feature of the U.S. economy for decades. The U.S. trade deficit in goods totaled approximately $1.2 trillion in 2024, according to Census Bureau data. This represents an increase from approximately $840 billion in 2017. The overall current account deficit, which includes trade and services and investment income, was approximately $950 billion in 2024. Tariffs were implemented with the stated goal of making imports more expensive, thereby reducing import volumes and encouraging domestic production to substitute for imports. The theory holds that higher import costs would shift purchasing toward domestic alternatives, reducing the trade deficit. The empirical outcome shows limited effect on the overall deficit. While specific bilateral deficits changed, particularly with China declining and deficits with other countries increasing, the aggregate deficit did not decrease. Several factors explain this outcome. First, demand for imported goods proved relatively inelastic. Consumers and businesses continued purchasing imports despite higher prices. Domestic alternatives were not available for many products or were significantly more expensive even compared to tariffed imports. Second, supply chain restructuring shifted sourcing from China to other countries rather than to domestic production. Imports continued but originated from Vietnam, Mexico, India, and other locations. The trade deficit with these countries increased while the China deficit decreased. Third, economic theory suggests that trade deficits reflect broader macroeconomic factors, including the relationship between national savings and investment. The United States has lower national savings rates than investment rates, requiring capital inflows from abroad. These capital inflows have accounting counterparts in trade deficits. Tariffs do not directly address these macroeconomic fundamentals. Fourth, a stronger dollar, partly resulting from U.S. economic growth and interest rate differentials, made U.S. exports less competitive and imports less expensive. Currency effects can offset tariff effects on trade flows. Economists differ on whether trade deficits should be a policy concern. Some argue that deficits represent consumption funded by foreign lending and result in accumulation of foreign debt. Others argue that capital inflows reflect foreign confidence in the U.S. economy and that trade flows balance through other mechanisms, including investment returns. This theoretical debate underlies different assessments of tariff policy objectives. The relationship between tariff policy and inflation has received extensive analysis. Tariffs increase prices for affected imported goods. If these goods represent significant portions of consumer spending, the effect appears in overall price indices. Research by Federal Reserve economists estimated that 2018 to 2020 tariff measures added approximately 0.3 to 0.5 percentage points to the consumer price index. This calculation accounts for the share of consumer spending on tariffed goods and the degree of price pass-through. During that period, overall inflation remained relatively modest at 1.5 to 2.5% annually, so tariff effects were measurable but not dominant. The current context differs. Inflation peaked above 8% in 2022 before declining to approximately 3% in 2024. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates substantially to control inflation. Additional price pressures from new tariff measures complicate monetary policy decisions about interest rate paths. The distributional effects are significant. Consumer expenditure surveys show that lower-income households spend larger portions of income on goods versus services. Tariffs primarily affect goods, particularly manufactured consumer products like clothing, electronics, and household items. Services like healthcare, education, and housing are largely unaffected by import tariffs. This creates regressive incidence where tariff costs represent larger percentages of income for lower-income households. A household spending 30% of income on goods, subject to tariffs that increase prices by 10%, experiences a 3% reduction in real income. A household spending 15% on such goods experiences 1.5% income reduction. Given that lower-income households spend higher proportions on goods, they face larger relative impacts. Middle-income households also face significant effects, but with somewhat smaller proportional impact. Higher-income households allocate relatively more to services and to goods categories less affected by tariffs, experiencing smaller proportional impacts. This distributional pattern represents a structural feature of tariff incidence rather than an intended policy outcome. Policymakers may or may not have considered these distributional effects when implementing tariffs. The effects emerge from the interaction between tariff structure and consumption patterns across income levels. Corporate responses to tariff costs include several strategies. Companies can absorb costs through reduced profit margins. They can increase prices to pass costs to customers. They can restructure supply chains to source from countries not subject to tariffs. They can apply for exclusion processes if available. They can reduce product quality or features to maintain price points. Documented corporate actions show extensive supply chain restructuring. Manufacturing operations have shifted from China to Southeast Asian countries, Mexico and India. This involves building or expanding facilities, establishing supplier relationships, implementing quality control systems, and restructuring logistics networks. The restructuring process requires substantial time and capital. Industry reports indicate typical timelines of 3 to 5 years for comprehensive supply chain changes in complex manufacturing. Costs include facility construction, equipment installation, worker training, and temporary inefficiencies during transition periods. Some restructuring represents genuine relocation of production. Other cases involve transshipment, where Chinese products are routed through third countries with minimal processing before export to the United States. U.S. Customs has increased scrutiny of such arrangements and implemented regulations to prevent tariff evasion through false country of origin claims. The long-term effect of restructuring is permanent change in global manufacturing networks. If tariffs remain in place indefinitely, companies have incentive to complete restructuring despite high costs. If tariffs are temporary or subject to legal invalidation, companies face uncertainty about whether to invest in restructuring or to absorb costs temporarily. Tariff policy is framed in political discourse as protecting American workers and industries from unfair foreign competition. The narrative emphasizes bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States, strengthening industrial capacity, and reducing dependence on foreign supply chains, particularly from geopolitical competitors. This framing appears in administration statements, political campaign materials, and legislative proposals. The message resonates with constituencies in regions affected by manufacturing job losses and communities experiencing economic dislocation from globalization. Alternative framing emphasizes consumer costs, economic efficiency, and alliance relationships. Critics argue that tariffs raise costs for households, reduce purchasing power, and function as regressive taxation. They cite economic research on efficiency losses from trade restrictions and potential damage to diplomatic relationships with allied countries subjected to tariffs. Public opinion shows divided views. Polling indicates approximately 40 to 50% of Americans support tariffs for protecting domestic manufacturing, while similar percentages express concern about consumer prices. Views correlate with employment sector, educational background, and political affiliation. The political sustainability of tariff policy depends partly on whether economic costs become salient to voters. If price increases are modest or attributed to other factors, political support may remain stable. If costs are substantial and clearly linked to tariffs, support may erode. The 2024 elections and polling suggest that this issue remains contested, with different constituencies weighing costs and benefits differently. Tariff revenue represents income to the federal government. Collections are recorded in treasury accounts and can fund government operations or reduce borrowing needs. Tariff revenue increased from approximately $35 billion in 2017 to over $80 billion by 2024, according to Treasury data. This revenue must be evaluated in context. Total federal receipts exceed $4.5 trillion. Tariff revenue represents approximately 1.5 to 2% of total receipts. Individual income taxes contribute approximately 50%. Payroll taxes contribute approximately 35%. Corporate income taxes contribute approximately 7%. Tariffs are a modest revenue source relative to total government financing. The revenue also comes with economic costs. Tariffs create market distortions by making some economic activities artificially more expensive. This reduces economic efficiency as resources are allocated based on tariff-distorted prices rather than underlying productivity. Economists measure these costs through deadweight loss calculations. Research estimating deadweight losses from tariffs varies in methodology and results, but generally finds that costs exceed revenue collected. One study estimated that 2018-2020 tariffs generated approximately $80 billion in revenue over that period, but created approximately $50 to $70 billion in deadweight losses, plus additional costs through reduced economic growth. The net fiscal benefit is smaller than gross revenue when all effects are considered. Alternative revenue mechanisms could generate equivalent funds with potentially lower economic distortions. Income taxes, consumption taxes, carbon taxes, and other options exist. The choice of revenue source involves trade-offs between efficiency, distributional effects, administrative feasibility, and political viability. The argument for tariffs as revenue source often includes non-revenue objectives like industrial policy or national security. When evaluated as multi-purpose policy tools rather than pure revenue measures, the analysis becomes more complex and depends on weighting different objectives. Long-term structural implications depend on whether current tariff levels persist, or whether they represent negotiating positions that will eventually moderate. If tariffs remain elevated indefinitely, several consequences follow. Global supply chains will permanently reconfigure. Manufacturing will be distributed across more countries with less concentration in any single location. This may increase resilience against disruptions, but reduces efficiency from economies of scale and specialization. The global trading system based on World Trade Organization rules and multilateral liberalization will weaken. If major economies pursue unilateral trade restrictions, the norm of negotiated mutual liberalization erodes. Other countries may respond with their own protectionist measures. Economic growth may slow modestly. Research estimating effects of sustained trade restrictions suggests global GDP could be 1 to 2% lower over a decade compared to alternative scenarios with continued liberalization. For the U.S. economy, estimates suggest 0.5 to 1% lower GDP growth cumulative over 10 years. Technology development may fragment into separate ecosystems. If U.S.-China economic decoupling extends beyond tariffs to technology restrictions, research collaboration will decline. This may accelerate some innovations through competition, but slow others that benefit from international cooperation. Alliance relationships may experience strain if trade restrictions apply to allied countries. European and Asian allies subjected to tariffs may reduce security cooperation or oppose U.S. initiatives in other domains. These implications remain uncertain because policy may change. Electoral outcomes, legal rulings, international negotiations, or economic conditions could lead to tariff reductions. The trajectory is not predetermined. To summarize the core analytical findings, recent tariff implementation relies on broad delegations of executive authority, particularly the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Legal challenges contest whether emergency justifications meet statutory requirements. Economic research documents that tariff costs are primarily passed to consumers through supply chain pricing. If tariffs are invalidated, corporate refund mechanisms exist, but consumers have no comparable compensation avenue. Trade deficit data shows limited overall reduction, despite stated policy objectives. Tariff effects contribute measurably to inflation, with regressive distributional impact on lower-income households. Companies are restructuring supply chains with substantial time and capital costs. Political framing emphasizes economic nationalism and industrial protection. Tariff revenue is modest relative to total federal receipts and comes with economic efficiency costs. Long-term implications include permanent supply chain restructuring, weakening of multilateral trade institutions, and modest reduction in economic growth trajectories. What remains uncertain is how courts will rule on legal challenges, whether tariffs will persist at current levels or be modified through negotiation or legal reversal, how corporations will complete supply chain restructuring given policy uncertainty, what political effects consumer price impacts will generate, and whether current measures represent fundamental shift in U.S. trade policy or temporary deviation. The key variables shaping outcomes include judicial decisions on executive authority limits, congressional action on trade policy, international negotiation results, corporate investment decisions amid uncertainty, and voter responses to economic effects. Analysis continues tracking legal proceedings, trade flow data, price indices, and policy developments.